Do you wish your drawings were more accurate, that they looked more like what you were referencing? Do you look at a scene such as this that has really quite a lot of different elements to it and think it's just never going to fit together looking like this after I've drawn it? If that's you, these 5 keys I think may be exactly what you need to unlock accuracy in your drawing. I use all 5 of these every drawing, and I'm sure they're a huge reason why my drawings look as accurate as they do. In a moment, I'm going to draw this for you using these 5 keys. But first, let me tell you what they are, because they all involve the time before we pick up a pen. And one of the biggest problems we have with drawing inaccurately is we haven't actually observed what we need to observe to draw accurately. It's like we've tied 1.5 hands behind our backs before we've even started to draw. We're putting the pen on paper, but we're more blind than we think with the lines we draw because we haven't seen what we need to see to get them accurately placed. Often it's all about techniques and lines and a rush to get the pen on the paper and start doing something. But we really need to know what we're doing. These 5 keys are the 5 things that I observe before I start to draw and then that I look for as I draw. The first thing I observe is depth. Because if I'm going to draw accurately, I need to be able to convey, to create, to represent a sense of depth. It also helps me to understand what's happening with my shapes, where they are in relation with each other, and I find that's very helpful for accuracy. And I chose this drawing partly because it has a great depth of plane. We have this low-shaped shrub here, a large tree here, more shrubs going back, a hedge going back. We have a very fancy stairway, and further back again we have a very fancy building, which is actually the National Gallery in Berlin, which goes back quite some way. And then right at the back here we have some buildings. We have a colonnade that stretches back even behind this building. So we have a lot of depth here. And I need to have a sense of that because I need to think about how I'm going to represent this. And for me, I like to change my pens as I go, which means I need to have thought out beforehand what pens I'm going to use. And I'm thinking I'm going to be using a 0.5mm pen for this tree, for this shaped shrub, for the foreground, but I'm going to switch to a 0.3 for these further shrubs, these people in this midground, and these stairs here. And then I'm going to switch to a 0.2 for basically the National Gallery building. I'm going to switch to a 0.1 for these details up the back here, over here, and also for some of the architectural, sculptural detail that we have in the National Gallery and on the stairs. My second key is that I start to observe the proportions. And I'm particularly observing the proportions of a few key parts, and particularly where I'm going to start, because the starting point is always the hardest in a drawing, and it's always the most important because that's where we start to establish our proportions, where we start to draw lines that we will have to reference off. So in this scene, the proportions that I think are going to be, if you like, easiest to get correct are the proportions of these columns here and the gaps between them. Because when I draw this, I'm going to be drawing the column, and then I'm going to not just draw a second column, but I'm going to draw this space. As well. And these first proportions are very important. In fact, as I advised, it can be very helpful to do. I did not a thumbnail and not a warm-up sketch, but I did, if you like, a little experimental drawing where I just checked out where, if you like, I trialed how I was thinking, the sizes, the proportion I was going to do this. And then I measured the distance from here to here and compared it with the distance from here to here. because I was trying to draw at actual size as well. And that gave me a sense of, have I got these proportions correct of the columns, of the gaps, of the height? So my first key was depth. I got a good understanding of what was close, what was in the midground, what was far away. My second key was that I choose some areas and I look carefully at proportions. My third key is that I observe relative sizes of various elements in the drawing. Because if my drawing is going to look accurate, all the parts of the scene need to fit together and need to, if you like, look like they're in the right space, that people don't look like they're too far away or too close for the size that they are. Now in this scene, these shaped shrubs have a size relative to each other that becomes smaller as they move in the distance with the perspective of this viewing point. So it's important that I get these correct. I'm also particularly looking at this figure here and these figures here, both because I want to make sure, since I'm drawing directly in ink, that I leave space in my line work to place the figures, but also to get a sense of how large or small they are. So I'm looking at this figure in proportion to this hedge, because this hedge is a relatively simple shape to draw in. It's sort of like the column, but on its side. So I'll take a lot of care to position this and scale this accurately as one of the simpler shapes in our scene. And then I can see that this figure here scales so that they're approximately the same height as the hedge. And then I can scale this figure across to these figures who end up being just slightly larger looking because they're slightly closer to me. I'm also looking at the scale of the leaves because this tree is an important part of our scene. And while I don't want to get too caught up in drawing individual leaves, I still want to suggest how large the tree is. And if I get the leaves too large, that has the effect of making the tree look smaller. So I need to be aware of that scale. And I need to make sure when I do things such as these little round motifs for the decorations in the railings, that I get them small enough and that I put enough of them in. Or else again, it will change the effect of the size of the overall balustrade and stairway. My fourth key, and this one's very important in a scene such as this, is to observe the angles carefully. When I talk about angles, of course, I'm talking firstly, almost obviously, about the perspective angles. So in a view such as this, we get very extreme perspective angles. And so I need to observe this carefully enough that when I do this, I don't do something like that thinking that's going to be right, because if we compare the angle, we can see how far off it is. This is where the angle should be, nothing like what I've drawn. And this is why I talk about this careful observation of angles is so key for accuracy in our drawing, because no matter how beautifully we now render this side of the building, we can't escape the fact that the proportions are wrong. And because they're wrong, they're not going to meet up the right way here that they should here. And certainly this height is way too high. Instead of being down here, which is probably more where it should be, yes, it should be somewhere more like this, we've now doubled the height of the colonnade at the far end. If we had something on the other side of the roadway here that lined up with this, we're going to have this up here in our drawing, and so we're going to have a misalignment. But there are often more angles in a drawing besides perspective angles. Obviously, in this scene, this very grand entrance stairway has these angles. So when I draw these lines, I have to make sure I get these angles correct. And one way I can do that is to seek to get the shape's proportion correctly. And this is where all these things start to work together, you see. I talked about observing proportions. So we observe the proportions of this triangle. And we see, in fact, that here and here pretty much are equal. if I can see that I'm going to be drawing a triangle that's going to look more like this, then I know one of my angles is not correct. And so before I actually commit to lines, I often put little dots or dashes, or I'll hold my pen at a very oblique angle and just get a very faint line. And I'll often do a line such as this, check the angle, and then if it's not correct, I know I need to make it a little bit more or a lot more when I draw it in. But it gives me a reference point, even though I know it's wrong. An incorrect reference point is a great help then in drawing accurately. And the final key, the final observation, because these are, as I said, all observations before we start to draw, and this is probably one that I use the most, is alignment. If we draw accurately, and if we take a great deal of care, particularly at the start, to establish accurate proportions, to scale things correctly, to get the angles correct, then when I draw more, I can align off what I'm drawing. If I draw these 3 columns incorrectly, I can draw 3 columns, I can draw the line across, I can draw the line above here, I can position this statue, I can actually put this column in, although I don't bring it down quite as far, but that lets me put this point in, the top of the stairs, because it aligns with the center of that column. Then I can get this angle coming down. I can align this section here with this gap between these 2 columns. It's closer to the end column, and that lets me position this angle. And when I've got this angle, I can position this angle. And I know that this spot here is going to line up with somewhere between the 4th and the 5th columns, but much closer to the 4th column. And then if I've got these details across here accurately drawn, when I'm drawing these shrubs, I can actually reference them off what I've drawn above. So when I'm drawing this hedge here, I'm able to say, well, it comes to pretty much level with that 2nd column. And this shrub here finishes there, which is about level with the end of the building. And so I'm using alignment all the time. And if when I go to draw a line, I'm not absolutely confident where that line starts, where it finishes, and what the angle is, I know I need to come back and observe the depth, the proportions, the scale, the relative sizes, the angles, or the alignment more closely, because that will tell me where to start or end my line, or if in fact there's a line I've already drawn that I need to correct, because I know that overall, in almost all cases, it will still improve the drawing to do so. So now I'm going to draw this scene. At times you'll see me quite explicitly do things. You'll often see me bring my pen to the reference and actually be doing this, be working out the alignment, because that's a process that is constant throughout the whole drawing. And if you want to have a go drawing this yourself, of course, I've posted this photo reference on my channel community page. I think this is a good example to practice these 5 keys. You can watch me draw it now in just a few minutes, and then if you want to, you can hang around for a few more minutes and see what it looks like in real time. Let's start. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. Just while you watch a couple of minutes of real-time drawing of the National Gallery in Berlin, let me say I hope you found it helpful and interesting, and I really do hope you have a go drawing it. It's not an easy scene, but I think it's one where we can learn a lot about observation and drawing accurately. But look, whatever you draw, however you draw it, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.